On the morning of January 7th, 1859, a prospector named George A. Jackson made camp along the frozen edge of Chicago Creek, in the mountains west of what is now Idaho Springs, Colorado. The ground was locked under snow. He built a fire to thaw the earth beneath it, and when the fire burned down, he scraped through the softened soil at the creek bed and found color in the pan. Gold, sitting in the gravel where the water had carried it for longer than anyone standing there could account for. Jackson kept the discovery to himself through the rest of that winter, a decision that would later be treated as its own small mystery by the historians who tried to reconstruct his movements. By spring, word had gotten out anyway, and the rush that followed turned a quiet mountain creek into one of the founding sites of the Colorado Gold Rush. What Jackson could not have known, standing over that thawed patch of frozen ground, was that the same water table he had just disturbed would still be a problem for the people who came after him more than 80 years later. Not a metaphor, the same water, moving through the same rock, toward the same creek, under a mountain that would eventually be laced with more tunnel than anyone in 1859 could have imagined necessary. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Within a few decades, the district around Idaho Springs and neighboring Central City had grown into one of the most productive hard rock mining regions in the American West, and it had developed the exact problem every hard rock district eventually develops: water. The deeper the shafts went, the more water they struck, and by the 1890s, miners across the district were reportedly spending as much as a third of their working hours simply pumping their own tunnels dry before they could swing a pick. Steam-powered pumps ran around the clock in shafts up and down the gulch, burning fuel that had to be hauled in by wagon, just to hold back water that would return within days of any pump breaking down. Ore sat untouched below the waterline, some of it richer than anything already extracted, because nobody could reach it without drowning the shaft that led to it. A Salt Lake City mining financier named Samuel Newhouse proposed a different kind of solution, one that did not fight the water so much as give it somewhere to go. A single long tunnel, driven into the base of the mountain on a shallow downward grade, low enough to intercept the flooded workings of dozens of separate mines and let gravity carry the water out on its own, without a single pump. Construction began in 1893. It would not finish for 17 years. What the finished tunnel became was, by any measure, an engineering achievement built almost entirely out of necessity. Just over 4 miles of excavated rock, driven on a grade of roughly 1/2%, precise enough that water entering at the far end would travel downhill the entire distance and exit under its own weight at the portal in Idaho Springs. Crews working from both directions had to hold that grade true through solid granite for mile after mile, with nothing close to modern survey equipment, relying on transits, plumb lines, and decades of accumulated hard rock experience. Along the way, it intersected nearly every major gold mine between there and Central City, tying together an estimated 250 miles of connected shafts and drifts into a single drainage system. It did more than drain water. A narrow-gauge rail line ran the length of the tunnel, and loaded ore cars could be run directly out through it to a mill built at its mouth, cutting out the cost and danger of hoisting rock up a vertical shaft. The mill itself, finished in 1913 and known as the Argo, used an oil flotation process refined from an idea developed by a chemist named Carrie Everson, together with cyanide leaching and mercury amalgamation, allowing it to recover as much as 95% of the gold in the ore it processed, at a time when most competing mills were losing nearly half of what they fed into the crusher. 10 stamps, each weighing over 1,000 pounds, crushed ore around the clock, and people in town said afterward that the pounding could be heard for 20 miles on a still night. For 30 years, the tunnel and the mill operated as one machine. What went in as flooded, unreachable rock came out, eventually, as bullion. None of that record is disputed. It is documented in mining journals from the period, in the tunnel's own listing on the National Register of Historic Places, in the corporate history of the company that operated it. What happened on the 19th of January 1943 is documented too, though far less comfortably. A crew was working to extend a lateral drift toward the Kansas shaft, one of the older workings tied into the tunnel system, when a blast opened into a section of old flooded working that had gone unmapped as still holding water. Pumping in that section had stopped years earlier, once the ore near it had been judged not worth the cost of keeping it dry. Nobody underground that day had reason to believe there was still pressure sitting behind that wall of rock. The blast found out otherwise. What the crew broke into was not a trickle finding its level. It was a column of water that had been sitting, sealed and building weight, for long enough that nobody left on site could say with certainty how long. Witnesses described the water coming down the grade of the tunnel and out through the portal for hours afterward, with enough force that it was compared at the time to water forced from a fire hose. 4 men working in the tunnel that morning did not make it out. The federal government's wartime order closing non-essential gold mines across the country was already in effect by that point, issued the previous autumn under the designation Limitation Order L-208 to redirect labor and equipment toward materials the war effort actually needed. The Argo Tunnel and its mill were never going to reopen under those conditions regardless of what had happened in the Kansas lateral. But the flood decided the manner of the ending. The tunnel was sealed, the mill went quiet, and for the next 75 years, almost nobody walked back into that stretch of rock. The silence that followed is itself part of the record, and it is worth naming plainly, rather than treating it as an unremarkable gap. A 4-mile engineered tunnel, tied into 250 miles of mine workings, representing decades of Colorado's most productive gold extraction, sat essentially untouched for the better part of 30 years. Its portal fenced off, its mill equipment left standing under a slow accumulation of dust and pigeon droppings. A man named Jim Maxwell is credited with saving the site from that neglect in the 1970s, buying the property, and beginning the long work of stabilizing the mill building before it collapsed entirely. Even under his ownership, the tunnel itself, the section where the water had come through, stayed closed. Tour groups walked the mill floor and panned in a shallow demonstration shaft nearby, but the 4-mile drift behind the sealed portal remained off limits for another 4 decades on top of that. It was not reopened to public access, even partially, until a new ownership group took over the site from Maxwell and began offering guided sections of the tunnel again starting in 2017, marking the first time in 75 years that paying visitors, rather than engineers in protective gear, were allowed to walk that stretch of rock. Between the flood and that reopening sits a gap of 75 years in which the tunnel existed mainly as a name on a historic registry and a source of contaminated drainage that state and federal agencies would eventually have to manage on their own terms. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Long before the tunnel reopened for tours, it had already re-entered the public record for a different reason. Water draining continuously from the sealed portal carried heavy metals, iron, zinc, and other contaminants leached out of 250 miles of abandoned workings, straight into Clear Creek, the same stream that runs past the mill and through the middle of Idaho Springs itself. By the 1980s, the scale of that contamination had drawn the attention of the Environmental Protection Agency, and the mining district around the tunnel was designated part of a federal Superfund cleanup site. A treatment plant was eventually built directly at the tunnel's mouth, and it has been in continuous operation since, filtering the same water that once drowned 4 men before it is allowed to reach the creek. That plant does not treat a memory. It treats an active discharge, measured and logged, from a tunnel that has technically been closed to mining for more than 80 years, and has never once in all that time stopped producing water that someone downstream has to account for. The Argo was not the only tunnel of its kind, and it is worth being precise about that, because the pattern across sites is where the warning becomes something more than a single accident in a single mountain. Decades before Newhouse financed his tunnel outside Idaho Springs, engineers on the Comstock Lode in Nevada had already run into an identical problem in an identical form. Mines beneath Virginia City were flooding and overheating faster than they could be worked, some shafts reportedly reaching temperatures that made unprotected labor nearly impossible at depth, and the answer, proposed years earlier by an engineer named Adolf Sutro and eventually completed in 1878 after more than a decade of construction and open opposition from mine owners who resented the toll he charged to use it, was a drainage adit driven for nearly 4 miles into the base of Mount Davidson to intercept the flooded lower levels of the Comstock mines and let the water run out under gravity, exactly the principle Newhouse would apply on the other side of the Rockies 15 years later. Different mountain, different ore body, same unavoidable engineering answer to the same unavoidable problem water creates underground. The second comparison sits far closer to home, in the mining district around Leadville, Colorado, roughly 100 miles to the southwest. Leadville's mines flooded so consistently through the 1890s that district operators funded their own version of the same solution, a long-gravity drainage tunnel known as the Yak Tunnel, built in stages between 1895 and 1923, eventually reaching more than 3.5 miles into the mountain, specifically to unwater the mines on the district's southern side. A second tunnel followed in the 1940s, built by the federal government's Bureau of Mines during the Second World War, specifically to keep metal production moving for the war effort, the same wartime pressure that had shut the Argo down on the other side of the mountains, and later transferred into the care of the Bureau of Reclamation. For decades, both tunnels did exactly what they were built to do, quietly and without incident, water leaving the mountain on schedule, largely unremarked outside the district itself. Then, in February of 2008, a blockage inside that same Leadville drainage system triggered a genuine state of emergency. An estimated 1 billion gallons of metal-laden water had built up behind the obstruction, with engineers warning of a possible uncontrolled release toward the town of Leadville itself and the headwaters of the Arkansas River below it. Officials, including the state's governor and one of its United States senators, arrived on site within days of the warning. An emergency relief well was drilled to relieve the pressure before the tunnel gave way on its own terms rather than anyone else's, and a formal risk assessment was commissioned afterward, specifically to determine how close the district had come to losing that argument. 3 separate mountains, 3 separate mining companies, operating decades apart, with no coordination between them, in 2 different states, under 2 different sets of state and federal regulators. And in each case, the same solution to the same underground problem eventually produced the same kind of event. Water, once trusted to a tunnel and largely forgotten, finding a way to remind the people above ground that it was still there, still under pressure, still waiting on the other side of rock that looked solid until it wasn't. What is consistent across all 3 sites is not simply the engineering, it is the gap between the day a tunnel was declared finished and the day someone was forced to reckon with what it was actually still holding back. At the Comstock, that gap was measured in decades of litigation over tolls and access, not in physical failure. At Leadville, it was measured in a blockage nobody detected until the pressure behind it had already reached a level engineers described as capable of reaching the town itself. At the Argo, it was measured in the space of a single blast, on a single January morning, against a wall of rock that had been quietly holding its shape since long before anyone alive in 1943 had gone to work that day. The 1943 flood at the Argo was not an isolated freak accident inside one badly mapped drift. It was the same warning that Sutro's engineers had already built an entire tunnel around in the 1870s, and the same warning that nearly forced an evacuation of an entire Colorado town in 2008. The mountain does not distinguish between centuries. It only keeps score of what has been drained and what has been left standing behind an old wall, waiting. What the Argo flood demands of anyone looking at it honestly is a recalibration of what closed actually meant in 1943 for a hard rock mine of that scale. The tunnel was not empty when it was sealed. It was full of unmapped water under pressure in some sections, of 250 miles of connected old workings in others, of ore that had never been brought out, and machinery that was simply left where it stood the day the mill went quiet. That is not the record of an operation that reached a natural end. It is the record of an operation that stopped abruptly, mid-motion, for reasons that arrived from two directions at once, a fatal accident and a wartime order, within the same handful of weeks. The physical evidence of that stoppage survives today in a very specific, very traceable place, not locked away in an archive but standing in daylight beside a highway. The reopened section of the Argo Tunnel is walked by paying visitors on a guided tour, past timber sets and rail lines left exactly where the last working crew abandoned them, the same narrow-gauge track still running toward a portal that swallowed 4 men on a January morning. The Environmental Protection Agency still operates a water treatment facility at the tunnel's mouth, permanently, because water still drains continuously out of that mountain from workings nobody has fully mapped since the day the pumps stopped, a legacy of the district's designation as part of a Superfund cleanup site decades later. The tunnel that Samuel Newhouse financed to solve a flooding problem in 1893 is, more than a century later, still actively being managed for exactly that same problem under a different set of engineers, using a different kind of equipment, treating water that has not stopped moving since George Jackson first knelt over a thawed patch of creek bed in 1859 and found out what was underneath it. That is the shape the whole record takes, once it is laid out end-to-end rather than left in separate folders. A creek that gave up gold to a man with a fire, and a pan on a frozen morning nobody thought to write down until it mattered. A tunnel built 2 generations later to manage the water that same discovery eventually required someone to control, on a grade so precise it still functions exactly as designed more than 100 years later. A flood that killed 4 men on a January morning because a wall of rock held a warning nobody underground that day had any way of reading in advance, followed within weeks by a wartime order that made sure nobody would go back in to read it properly for a very long time. A silence of 75 years, broken only when a new owner decided the story, and the risk, were worth walking back into. A pair of sister tunnels, in Nevada and 100 miles closer to home, that solved the identical problem and were forced, decades apart, to answer for it in their own way. And a treatment plant running today on the same mountain over the same water, because the thing that made Idaho Springs valuable in 1859 has never actually stopped being there. It only went quiet for a while. The mountain kept its own record the entire time, in the one place records cannot be sealed, revised, or lost. In the water itself, still finding its way out, still under a town that has learned, at considerable cost, exactly how much respect that water is owed. Visitors who walk the property today move through a 5-story mill building that still houses the original crushing and processing equipment, largely intact rather than reconstructed for effect. A separate, older working nearby, known as the Double Eagle, is included on a self-guided portion of the tour, alongside a gold panning demonstration meant to give visitors a physical sense of the same motion that drew prospectors to the district in the first place. The current owners, who took over the site from Jim Maxwell's family, have spoken openly about a different kind of toll the district exacted, one that never made it into a single dramatic headline the way the 1943 flood did. Silicosis, the lung disease caused by decades of breathing rock dust in unventilated shafts, reportedly took many district miners before they reached middle age, a slower and far less visible casualty count than the 4 men lost in the tunnel. That detail rarely appears on a historical marker. It survives instead in family recollection, passed down by people who still run the site, a reminder that the mountain's ledger includes entries no blast, flood, or federal order was ever needed to produce. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.